You were part of the Writers Guild of America for 56 years, and you finally decided to leave after this guild just remained completely silent on the atrocities happening in Israel. What made this the point for you to finally leave after years of the guild promoting woke causes, BLM, George Floyd, LGBTQ issues? What made now the time when you just decided to quit?
Well, I don't and did not have a problem with the Guild saying that what happened to George Floyd was wrong, and people needed to speak up about it. I didn't have a problem with the Guild endorsing the Me Too movement. As someone who's been in Hollywood for over a half a century, I certainly know that women were taken advantage of by powerful men. And by the way, gay men were taken advantage of by powerful gay men as well. That was part of the culture of Hollywood. But those things pale in comparison to the beheading of babies. I mean, I think that one has to have a sense of proportion about these things. We're talking about, oh, yes, there's a culture that's pervasive in Hollywood that is demeans women, and in some cases physically assaults women, and yes, that's an awful thing. Women were not just assaulted on October 7th by Hamas terrorists. They were raped until their bones were broken and they couldn't close their legs. They were mutilated. They were burned alive. They were murdered. They were tied up to their babies and then burnt alive. They had their children murdered in front of them. If one cannot bring oneself, in their own words, to find a consensus to condemn that after 3 weeks, maybe you don't have to do it within 24 hours. Maybe you're in shock. Maybe it takes time to get everybody on a Zoom call. Maybe people have other things to do. Fair enough. But after 3 weeks of deafening silence, they finally issued this lame statement which said, we couldn't find a consensus. And that really was the straw that broke the camel's back. If you can't, what that means is probably the majority of the leadership did not want to offend the newer woke members of the Guild. And so therefore they said nothing. Well, that's morally reprehensible. That's absolutely morally reprehensible. It's not that you have a broken moral compass, it's that you have no moral compass. And I knew that if I resigned publicly enough, I would have a platform at least for a day in which to speak out, both against the cowardice of the Guild's leadership, and also, if my Guild wasn't going to condemn Hamas, then I sure as hell was going to condemn Hamas in the loudest voice I possibly could.
Right. Why do you think Hollywood and the entertainment industry is this way, where they're so afraid of condemning, something that everyone should condemn? As you mentioned, the rape and the most gruesome murders. They on one hand, they tout the hashtag Me Too drums. They were major proponents of the so-called feminist movement, but now they're so quiet on this. And as you probably know, in many cases, a lot of mainstream celebrities just went straight to claiming that Israel's at fault. Susan Sarandon, Mark Ruffalo, I could go on and on. Why is this culture in Hollywood? Why does it seem so hypocritical to you? Do you think it's hypocritical? And and why? Why are they totally ignoring this?
Well, I think you need to divide two groups there. The Jews in Hollywood, or at least a significant number of Jewish celebrities, spoke out and spoke out very firmly. And they were joined by a few courageous people like Chris Rock, who I have nothing but admiration for. Those Jews, I think, suddenly found out how alone they are in Hollywood. It takes no moral courage to virtue signal and at #MeToo. There is no moral courage in that because everybody in your social circle is doing it. So if you don't do it, you're not cool. You're not part of that social circle. You're not. In fact, you risk being ostracized for being silent. So people jump into that. There are some true believers, like Mark Ruffalo, who is either an asshole or he's a Jew-hating son of a bitch. And I wouldn't be afraid to say that to his face. I'd love to say that to his face. Yeah, but I think and he may be both. But he definitely is one or the other. I know Susie Sarandon not well. I worked with her once. I thought she was a very nice person. I liked her a lot. But I think she long ago fell into this rabbit hole which sees the world in a binary choice between oppressor and oppressed. And if you are perceived to be white, you are the oppressor. What most of these folks don't take into account is that the majority of Israelis are brown-skinned people whose families have been in the Middle East for 2,000 years before Muhammad's mother was born. That we are the indigenous people. We are the natives to that part of the world. But because Jews are perceived to have white privilege, quote unquote Jewish privilege, then automatically they fall into that lot that one automatically feels duty bound to condemn. And I'm sorry to see that with Susie Sarandon, because like I say, as a person, I like her. I thought she was a very nice person to work with. She was a good colleague. But I think her worldview is bent very badly when someone who stands for women's rights cannot denounce the people who mutilated and murdered so many women on that day. I mean, all one needs to do is take a look at the horrible video of that poor young German Israeli woman, Shani Luke, who was raped and pretty well beheaded, and then her body paraded through the streets of Gaza to the shouts of Allahu Akbar. If you can't condemn that, if you can look at those images and still see a moral equivalence between Hamas and Israel, then you should question why God gave you eyes.
You mentioned a little bit earlier that you believe a lot of Jewish people who are working in the entertainment industry, they've realized how alone they are this past month.
Yeah.
And Hollywood, obviously, there's that stereotype. Jewish people in America, most of us are deemed liberal, and there's a lot of us in the entertainment industry. Do you think that have you spoken with Jewish peers who have felt that rude awakening and maybe were more liberal than before October 7th and are suddenly starting to maybe think a little bit differently about the world and about the people who they thought were their allies in progressive movements? Have some of them woken up?
I've talked to people. I don't know that it's so much a notion of, oh, maybe certain of my liberal notions were wrong. It's that they suddenly feel very much alone and very vulnerable, and many of them very frightened. And by the way, they have good reason to feel that way. I just, this morning, there was the news of a 69-year-old Jewish man who was killed in Westlake Village, California. Well, that's where I raised my children. I lived there for 30 years. I would have told you that may have been one of the safest places for Jews to live on planet Earth. He was killed at the corner of Westlake Boulevard and Thousand Oaks Boulevard. I know exactly where it was because it was a quarter mile away from my house. And it's not just that he was killed. The person who killed him has not yet been, though the police know who that was, has not yet been arrested.
Right.
Now, it seems to me, in any other circumstances where there's no question that this was a gentleman who struck the man who then fell backwards and hit his head, the medical examiner said, I can see a mark on his face. So I know he was struck in the face. And I was a reserve police officer in LA for 20 years, so I know a little bit about police work. You would take that person into custody. You would call the DA. The first thing you would not do, as did, and I don't want to criticize the sheriff of Ventura County, but I guess I am. The first thing you would not do is say, well, in the light of this, we're going to protect the Muslim houses of worship and the Jewish places of worship. I thought that was a rather odd juxtaposition. But I think Jews need to wake up in this country and figure out who our friends are and who our friends are not. And I think that's a rude awakening for a lot of Jews. But it is time for them to wake the hell up.
Speaking of, in that case, where do we go from here? Because the Jewish people were such a small population, and already you have Jewish people who have not yet maybe waking up, or who are peddling some of the mantra, some of the anti-Israel mantra, and although it is a small minority, they seem to be the loudest. And you have that plus a world of people who we thought were allies, and then they turn against us. So what do we do now? How do we protect ourselves? How do we, every couple of years, anti-Semitism rises this ugly head. It's really always been here, but every so often we're reminded once again. So how do we defend ourselves?
Well, there's a couple things there. I don't think in my lifetime I've ever witnessed anti-Semitism at the level that it is today, and at the level of public acceptance in the media that it is today, that it is legitimized. When I grew up, the people that Jews had good reason to be concerned about were right-wing and were Southern Baptists, and were sort of old-fashioned Jew haters. Today, the people that one has to be concerned about are on the left, and evangelicals are amongst our very best friends. And I think we as Jews are still living somehow in the 1960s, when it was the other way around, and we need to make a course correction and realize, like I say, who our friends are and who our friends are not. Our friends are not the liberal left. I'm sorry to say it. And there's always been a particular brand of Jew who believes that if they just mouth the right mantra that is prevalent amongst the Jew hater, they'll be the last in the room to be eaten by the tiger. Well, right. They're mistaken. And there may actually be some that actually believe the drivel they espouse, in which case, I'm reminded, I once did a movie some years ago called Gulag, and I interviewed probably 100 people who were former inmates in the Soviet Gulag. There was a guy whose name I remember, his name was Berger, and he was a Russian Jew who had spent 35 years in the Gulag. And he said he remembered someone literally on the transport from Lubyanka prison who turned to him and said, if only Comrade Stalin knew what was going on. That's the level of self-delusion of which some people are capable. So there may actually be some Jews out there who believe the drivel that they're espousing. I think there are others who, like I say, espouse it in the vain hope of being the last in the room to be eaten by the tiger. But whatever the case may be, I think the majority of the Jews in the United States need to figure out who their friends are, who their friends are not, and make some adjustments in their lives. And it's going to be uncomfortable.
Right.
You may have to resign from a board or a guild. You may have to notify a university at which you've been giving scholarships. You're not going to give those scholarships anymore. You're not going to support that university anymore. And you may have to find some new folks to support and some new causes with which to align yourself. But this is a dangerous time for Jews in this country, and we ought to wake up to it.
Do you believe that part of the reason American Jews especially a lot of them have turned away and maybe even stuck their heads in their sand, at least up until October 7th, is the fact that they're comfortable living in America right now, and despite all of our problems, we've been a very, very good country. It's almost as if, and personally, in my own experience, I'm young, I'm part of Gen Z. So a lot of my Jewish peers in college and even in high school growing up, they didn't have the memory of anti-Semitism that their parents and their grandparents had. They were comfortable. And we grew up in the early 2000s where we were told everything was just getting more progressive, and we were all tolerant, and diversity and inclusion was being pushed in our school curricula. So we thought all these problems were already solved. Do you think that's maybe part of the issue?
What do you think now? Let me turn the tables and ask you. What do you think now?
I was completely wrong when I thought, although I learned my lesson a little bit earlier than my peers did. And I think some of my peers and even family members who are more on the left are still wearing rosy glasses and think that we're not in trouble. But I experienced anti-Semitism from the left in college. And it was interesting to see that my Hillel group, and I'm sure you know Hillel, they got angry with me because I wrote an article exposing a dormitory advisor for taping up an anti-Semitic poster on the wall, an image of the Star of David with a slash over it. And they said that I should take the article down because they said, quote, as anti-BDS trained activists, we're taught we don't want to poke the bear if something happens because it could cause more anti-Semitism. So that was my personal experience, and it woke me up very early. And I was raised properly. My parents always warned me that what they experienced and that it will never really change. But I don't think it's the same for a lot of young people, a lot of young Jewish people, and a lot of older Jewish liberals who have been living in America for a long time and who maybe didn't wake up until October 7th.
Yeah, I think you're probably a wiser generation in terms of your awareness of anti-Semitism than your parents' generation, because I think there's not a Jewish kid on a college campus today who has not experienced anti-Semitism. And if your parents are in their 40s, mid 40s, maybe up to 50, they probably never experienced anti-Semitism. I know, you're young enough to be my granddaughter. So I know that my sons, who are in their 40s, never experienced anti-Semitism until now. So
Incredible.
it is an awakening for them. And I was born in a different time, and I was born in a little oaky, arky town in California, and it was called Bell Gardens, made up mainly of people who came out during the Grapes of Wrath era, and we were the only Jews in town. And I became an ardent Zionist at 8 years of age, because that's when I was attacked by a group of about 8 or 10 kids who were 3 or 4 years older than me, who
Right.
Tortured me in ways that I don't even feel comfortable talking about to this day. And I got a very good wake-up call at 8 years of age. But my children never experienced that. Never experienced that. They grew up in that wonderful town of Westlake Village in California, where today a man was murdered for standing up for Israel. And I think that has brought it home to my own sons, probably in a more immediate way than I can describe. That was their very comfortable home. But I do think that your generation of people who are on college campuses today have already experienced anti-Semitism. And in regards to your Hillel group telling you, that's really an old diaspora Jewish attitude. There was a Rabbi, Stephen F. Wise, who was the great American Jewish liberal rabbi. There's a synagogue named after him.
Right.
Very connected. He knew Roosevelt and he knew everybody. And when it became clear that the Holocaust was in full scale and people were trying to get FDR to do something, he famously said the Jews ought to be quiet. And that was in the face of the Holocaust, of Hitler, when he knew what was going on. And the advice was, we don't want to make too much noise. It's time for us to make some noise. It's time for Jews to fight back. It's time for Jews to get a little bit stiff-necked and not apologize for being Jewish, and not say, yes, the massacres were terrible, but you have to understand the horrors of the occupation. That's bullshit, excuse me. The first time I was ever shot at in my life was in 1963 as a high school kid living in Israel. And I had volunteered to leave my kibbutz to go to kibbutz Nahal Oz, where just a month ago, scores of people were murdered and kidnapped. And there was no occupation in 1963. There were no territories. There were no settlements. There were no refugees from 1967 and 1963. I was planting a palm tree with another kid when Fedayeen terrorists from Gaza opened up with machine guns on us. And happily, you saw 2 Jews break the land speed record and get out of harm's way pretty quickly. But all the excuses that legitimize mass murder that are being offered up by the enablers of Hamas and their apologists, namely the occupation and the settlements, there were no such things in 1963. And you say, well, yes, but they were refugees from 1948. Well, it would do people good to know their history, because the Jews of Hebron were massacred, as were the Jews of Jaffa massacred in the 1920s and 1930s before there was a state of Israel.
Right.
Because there was a strain of Palestinian Arab, not all of them, but definitely a strain that would not accept a Jewish presence of any kind, of any size, anywhere in Israel. And people need to remember that in 1936, there was a thing called the Peel Commission, which gave the Jews a state that would have gone from Tel Aviv up north, turn right at the Valley of Jezreel, and include part of the lower Galilee. It was basically the size of LA County. And right. David Ben-Gurion famously said, yes, we'll take it, because he knew that the Jews of Europe needed a place to go to, and there was no such place. The Arabs of Palestine, led by Haj Amin al-Husseini, who was the sort of George Washington of the Palestinian national movement, said no. Now, you have to ask yourself, where did Haj Amin al-Husseini, the George Washington of the Palestinian national movement, spend World War II? He spent it in Berlin with Hitler, advising him on how to set up Muslim SS death squads in Yugoslavia. He was a wanted war criminal. And where did he go after World War II? When he was a wanted war criminal, he went to Gaza, where he became the first ruler of the all-Palestine government in Gaza up until 1959. So when people tell me about, oh, the Jews brought this on themselves, that was the Hitlerian lie. Except now, instead of saying, well, we're the multi-tentacled Bolsheviks, which was the Hitlerian lie, we are the white supremacist, colonialist, capital pigs, oppressor of the masses, the downtrodden Palestinian people, who, but for us, would welcome us with open arms and join hands and live with us in peace. There are Palestinians who would do that. Unfortunately, there's Hamas. And by the way, the Palestine Authority differs from Hamas in degree, but not in kind.
They fund them. They have the Palestinian Martyrs Fund, the Pay to Slay program.
Yes.
And we fund it. Our government restored taxpayer money, but it just seems what really just boggles me. But I guess, I mean, it's a pattern of the people, the same people who want to make a moral equivalence with Hamas terrorists and Jewish people trying to survive, is that every form of terrorism, they're now openly calling resistance. I remember back when I was in college, I did a little undercover project, and I filmed this crazy group affiliated with my campus that openly supported Hamas. And I thought, oh, this is absolutely insane. But I realized you don't have to go undercover anymore to expose that. They're openly saying Hamas is some type of resistance group, and when they say by all means necessary, they include the rape, the most brutal executions that we saw on October 7th. Yet it seems that sometimes they go back and forth. They can't decide whether to pretend that didn't exist, that didn't happen, as if they're denying the Holocaust again, or to justify it, because it's almost a form of doublespeak, that these anti-Semites, both in the Middle East and their proponents here, they're either saying, well, it didn't really happen, or it did happen, but it was justified. What do you respond to that with?
Well, I think you're absolutely right that it is a doublespeak. The point is, they're going to try and negate your legitimacy, even though what they're saying makes absolutely no sense. On the one hand, it never happened. Well, show me the pictures of the dead babies. Come on now. And how many dead babies were there? But if there were, it's legitimate resistance by any means necessary. You know, I saw Queen Reina of Jordan speaking to Christiane Amanpour, who has always seen herself as the moral arbiter of right and wrong in the Middle East, though I don't know who appointed her to that august role. I had the pleasure of being her escort officer as a member of the Israeli Army military spokesperson unit in the Second Lebanon War. And she was recently interviewing Queen Reina, who said, yes, the attacks were terrible, but you have to understand they didn't happen in a vacuum, and the history of the Middle East didn't start on October 7th, and this is the logical outcome of the oppression of the occupation. And you know, Ms. Amanpour is not stupid. She might even know her history. And if she does, she would know that Queen Reina's father-in-law, King Hussein of blessed memory, and I say that not sarcastically because I knew King Hussein. I met with him several times. I considered him at the end of his life as close to a holy man as anyone I've ever met. But that same King Hussein slaughtered thousands of Palestinians and expelled tens of thousands of Palestinians in what was called Black September, when they tried to assassinate him, and by the way, Queen Reina's husband, who was then a child. And King Hussein begged the state of Israel to intervene on his behalf, so that when Syrian tanks started coming in to support the PLO, who was trying to topple him and create the Palestinian state in Jordan, the state of Israel threatened to go to war with Syria unless they backed off. And it was Israel that saved King Hussein and his son, King Abdullah, the husband of Queen Reina, who so piously talked about the war crimes of Israel. And if she knew even more history, which I'm sure Christiane Amanpour does know, King Hussein's grandfather of blessed memory, after whom King Abdullah is named, was assassinated on the steps of Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third holiest place in Islam, not by Israeli settlers, but by Palestinian terrorists. So the hypocrisy of people who cherry pick incidents, not even facts of history, and use them to somehow find a moral equivalence between people who genuinely want to live in peace with their neighbors and people who openly and proudly state that their goal is the genocide of the Jewish people.
Right.
Amazes me that, you know, it is the chutzpah of the person, you know, of Hamas playing this game of starting a war with a massacre, and then complaining, oh my goodness, the Jews are being too rough in their treatment of us and they're committing war crimes. It's rather like the child who murders both his parents in their sleep and then throws himself on the mercy of the court on the grounds that he's an orphan. I don't know that you can get more hypocrisy than that.
As you mentioned earlier with some of the rhetoric Susan Sarandon has peddled, this idea that, well, we're automatically going to deem Jews as the oppressors because they look white, at least here in America. There's a lot of Ashkenazi Jews. That seems to be the narrative, that all Jews are white and therefore privileged, when, as you mentioned, most Jewish people living in Israel are Middle Eastern. They're not white. But no matter how many facts that we don't even have to present, it's just there, they seem to purposely brush over that fact. In fact, and you know, during Nazi Germany, Jews were murdered for one of the reasons not being white, and all of a sudden all Jewish people are considered white. Do you believe it's because now it's deemed you're an oppressor if you're white, and therefore, well, they of course want to label Jewish people with anything that's wrong of the current time. So suddenly we just switched races automatically.
I honestly think that if one wants to find evidence, whether you call it of Satan or of a force of pure evil in the world, Jew hatred is the proof that it exists. It is completely irrational. We have been hated for being Bolsheviks, and we're hated for being capitalists. We're hated for being white, and we're hated for being not white enough. We're hated for being different, and then we're hated for being people who try to be the same. We're hated for assimilating, and we're hated for being clannish. We're hated for being poor in the nations in which we were poor, and we were referred to as rats and vermin, and we're hated for being rich. were forced into occupations because we're Jews and then hated for succeeding in them. The labels make no difference. The label is whatever pair of clothes Jew hatred can put on that is fashionable in that particular moment. And it really doesn't matter what the clothes are. They're the legitimization for a totally, honestly demonic, irrational hatred of a people who have probably benefited mankind more than any other people in the history of the human race.
I mean, that being said, no matter how many times we've been persecuted and how many attempts to wipe us off the face of the earth, we keep surviving. And we don't just survive, we survive and we contribute more and more to society. Do you think that a major factor right now, and in my opinion, it's been a factor for hating Jews in the first place, a major factor contributing to the thousands of years of anti-Semitism, the fact that we do keep getting back up, and that we have a culture that is very productive, and that we do manage to find ourselves in leadership positions, in positions where we've actually helped the world, and we've helped ourselves, but not just ourselves, other people. We're in top positions in academia, but also in the medical field, in technology. Do you think that people right now, at least in this day and age, that might be a major contributing factor to the anti-Semitism, just blatant jealousy?
You know, anti-Semitism, as I say, which I don't like the phrase anti-Semitism, it's Jew hatred.
Right.
Jew hatred doesn't really need a logical reason. So my father was born in Tsarist Russia. Jews of Eastern Europe were abysmally poor.
Right.
Nobody in Tsarist Russia was jealous of the social position of a Jew. Jews were defenseless, by and large, at the lowest rung of the economic status of the time. They were less than second-class citizens. No sane Russian was ever jealous of a Jew. So when we say, oh yeah, the reason for anti-Semitism or Jew hatred is because they're jealous of how successful we are. Yeah, well, that might be the excuse of the day, but in the areas and the times where Jews were the poorest of the poor, Jew hatred still existed. If you take a look at the plight of Middle Eastern Jews, Jews of Yemen were less than second-class citizens, and even though they developed skills and they were artisans and they learned to be silversmiths because they were kicked out of other professions, a Jew could not, I remember when I was a kid in Israel, I went to a Yemenite synagogue on one Tisha B'Av, and here were, and again, this is in the early 1960s. So you had people who were of a generation who just came to Israel really 10, 12 years before. So I was in this, and they weren't old people. They were in their 40s, that in their 30s. And as they prayed, they sat on the dirt floor of the synagogue and they rocked back and forth in this kind of emotion. And I said, well, that's really interesting. Why do they do that? And I asked someone to explain it to me. And he said, that is the motion of a person who's riding a camel. And in Yemen, no Jew could ever be physically higher than a Muslim. So you couldn't be on a camel if you were a Jew in the presence of a Muslim. It was insulting. So I guarantee you those Yemenites who were not Jewish were never jealous of the Jews who were persecuted there. I say Jew hatred will find whatever excuse it needs, but it's always irrational. It's pretty damn near demonic. It's a kind of horrific virus that's worse than cholera, that's worse than COVID. It's a kind of plague, and it's a kind of collective madness.
Right.
That otherwise sane people seem to be affected by. And people who, again, you would say, when I was a kid, the people who were Jew haters were by and large ignorant. So you would say, well, if only they were educated. Well, today the Jew haters are by and large fairly well educated. It hasn't helped a bit. The most educated and cultural people on earth were the Germans.
Yeah.
The most cultured people that ever lived. They were the people of Beethoven and Mozart, of Bach. If culture was the word in Hebrew is chisun, the thing that makes you immune from anti-Semitism, then the Germans would have been the least anti-Semitic people on the face of the earth. No one was more cultured than the Germans. But Jew hatred doesn't care about education, doesn't care about culture, doesn't care about economic status. You know, some of the wealthiest Brits you'll ever meet are some of the biggest Jew haters. Some of the poorest Irish you'll ever meet are some of the biggest Jew haters. There's Jew hatred in China, where there are no Jews. That there's Jew hatred in Japan, where there are no Jews.
All right. Not even odd chapter.
Yeah, it is absolutely demonic. But it is there. It is a fact of life, and Jews ought to wake up to it. And as I say, act accordingly. And honestly, if anyone thinks or thought that Israel's fight is not our fight as Jews of the diaspora, or that, God forbid, if it wasn't for Israel, we wouldn't be hated as much as we are, now you realize what a fool's paradise you've been living in. Because the whole nonsense of occupation and genocide, if it were occupation and genocide, let me ask you a quick question. How many civilians, Muslim Arab civilians have been killed in the Yemen civil war? You know the number?
I don't, but I do know that the number has gone in Gaza. There's more Arabs living in Gaza than ever before.
Yes, well, that's a different thing. If we were committing genocide, one should see fewer people there than were in 1967. And in fact, the population of Gaza and the West Bank has quadrupled since 1967. So I wish that our people had suffered the kind of genocide that the Palestinians are complaining about, because then there would be 250 million more Jews on the face of the earth, which I wouldn't mind. But that's beside the point. As I say, in Yemen, 340,000 civilians have been killed. Do you see any marches, any rallies protesting the death of the poor Yemenis?
Nope, not at all.
In China, 1.5 million Muslim Uyghurs are in concentration camps. Is there anyone out there marching against communist China because of the persecution of the Muslim minority in China? No one. So
in fact,
the nonsense of this is done out of our concern for humanity, and we would act the same in the face of any injustice directed to any minority. Again, it's total and complete bullshit. It's a legitimization of Jew hatred. The people who care the least about the welfare of the Palestinian people are Hamas.
Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for joining me and for explaining why you left, and also thank you so much for your bravery and for speaking up. It is hard. I understand how hard it is in academia to speak up against what seems like a mob of thought leaders forcing you to believe one thing, but especially in the entertainment industry. So kol hakavod to you.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you again for joining us on BIPACT News on the Jewish TV channel. Tune in for more great programming on anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, and miseducation.